Welcome back. We are now in session 3 of class 8. We're all the way up to the book of Revelation. So now we want to look at interpreting Revelation and what our book calls images of judgment and hope. So when we look at Revelation, we consider it a completely unique book among the books of the New Testament, and in some ways it's completely unique among the books of the Old and New Testament. So Revelation stands alone as an apocalyptic type of book. Now, it's written to 7 churches in 7 literal cities in Asia Minor. It's rooted in historical, cultural, and geographic facts. But it's also a recording of John's vision, who was in exile on the island of Patmos. It's filled with rich and diverse symbolism, and John's words are rooted in over 250 references to the Old Testament. Now, for us today, all of that can seem overwhelming. We are not one of the 7 original churches. Visions are difficult to interpret. Symbolism makes it even more difficult. And then a lack of knowledge of much of the Old Testament, which was all they had, makes these things very difficult when we consider Revelation. So let's look more at what makes up the apocalyptic genre. Apocalyptic literature speaks about coming judgment and salvation. And it's important to note that really this type of literature is not something we have in common today. We do have Revelation, but we don't have many other books that are apocalyptic in their nature. So as we look at each of these things, we need to realize that we have a historical distance from the initial writing, and we want to try to do good exegesis. So the first is that John deals with coming judgment and salvation. For example, God judges Babylon. There's also his great white throne judgment in the end of Revelation. And then there's certainly time and time again where it says this calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints, and that eventually, if they will remain true to Jesus until the end, they will overcome and receive his salvation. This apocalyptic literature talks about number 2. It's born in time of persecution or great oppression. Now, a Bible dictionary would tell you that John was in exile because of his Christian faith, and that Revelation was given to him about 96 AD. And so as we look at who was in power in Rome, it was Domitian, and some research reveals that he was persecuting the Christians. So it's certainly born out of a time where Christians are persecuted for their faith. Number 3, apocalyptic literature looks to a future time when God will bring an end to history and righteousness will triumph over evil. As we read in Revelation, we see that Satan comes on the scene, and yet he's finally locked up and then eventually thrown into the lake of fire, along with the false prophet and the Antichrist and all those who did not receive Jesus Christ. So we see that final triumph over evil, and then we see the kingdom of God come in, and a new heaven and a new earth and a home of righteousness. Apocalyptic literature also includes number 4. It's presented in dreams, visions, cryptic language, and fantasy. We see things like beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns, or locusts with scorpion tails and human heads, and this symbolic use of numbers throughout. Or this woman who's clothed with the sun, and she's got the moon at her feet. All of these very interesting, symbolic, and vibrant word pictures that John paints for us. So it's definitely a unique type of literature. And so that asks the question, how do we perform proper exegesis on this unique book? Well, let's look at some principles. The first principle when considering how to exegete Revelation is the primary meaning of Revelation is what John intends it to mean and what his original readers understood it to mean. We're back to our exegetical foundational principles. What was the primary intent? Certainly, as we look at it and we understand through the historical context that Christians were being persecuted by the Roman Empire and by what would seem to be an all-powerful emperor who thinks he's a God-man. So when we see that, we need to realize that John's original readers of Revelation would have plugged in the Roman Empire and the emperor to many of the visions that John sees. Most likely, when we read about Babylon in Revelation, his original audience would have tied Babylon to Rome at the time. Number two, we need to understand that Revelation, in the context that John's readers did not have the rest of the New Testament to understand his words. Oftentimes you'll read in books about Revelation that we need to look at this portion of the text in light of what Jesus said in Matthew 24, or in Luke 21, or in Mark 13, or what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 about the lawless one and his destructive works, or Jesus' timeline about end times. And yet we shouldn't assume that those who John is sending the revelation to would also have those materials to reference against. The book of Revelation itself was meant to be sent out as a complete form of literature. So all the readers needed to know is included in the text of Revelation. That does not mean to say that God hasn't included it in a broader book of the Bible. It means to say that we can do good exegesis in Revelation without having to reference other books. Number three, we must first interpret images as John does. It's very easy to take those images and start to say, what do I think this means? But there are many places in Revelation where John, or one of the persons he's talking to, gives him the meaning behind the images he's seeing. For example, in chapter 1, as Jesus is talking with John and revealing these lampstands and these stars, the interpretation of those are given. It says that the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. One who is like the Son of Man is talking back to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, and we know that it's Jesus, a title he used of himself. So the interpretation of those images are nothing other than what has already been revealed in the book. We cannot then make them mean something else than what John already interpreted them to mean. Likewise, in chapter 12, verse 9, when it talks about that dragon, it identifies the dragon as that ancient serpent, or Satan, the devil. So we can't make the dragon be something other than what John has already told us that it is. Point number 4 for exegesis of Revelation is that we must see the visions as a whole, not make them an allegory or look for explanations for all details. The same principles we applied to the parables, that we need to understand the main point, also apply here when we look at the visions. Instead of looking at every little detail and saying this means that, let's look at the broader picture of the visions to try to understand the points that John was bringing across. Some of the details are there simply to provide dramatic effect. Things like the stars are shaken from a tree like figs dropping. That's dramatic effect. Or John provides extra details so that his original audience would clearly understand what he's seeing in that picture, and they would relate it to something in their own time, because that's all they would know. So, for example, in Revelation chapter 9, where John sees locusts with crowns of gold, human faces and women's long hair, these details are provided to bring the word picture to people living in Rome at the time who would easily identify those with the barbarian horde on the outer edges of the Roman Empire. So as they read it, that's what they see. As we read it today, we might think of something completely different. But good exegesis is to try to understand what the original audience saw it to mean and what John's original intent was for providing those details. Number 5, we must understand Revelation in light of the many Old Testament references and the continuation and consummation of the story. As I mentioned earlier, there are over 250 Old Testament references or parallels between Revelation and the Old Testament. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 9, we read about people going through the city and putting the mark of God on the foreheads of those who remain faithful to God. We see the same thing in Revelation chapter 7, that an angel goes through and puts a mark on the foreheads of those who remain faithful to God. Now, if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, you might say, this is a completely unique thing in Revelation and nowhere else in the New Testament. While it's true it's not elsewhere in the New Testament, it's certainly found in the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. And that's just one example. There are many other parallels to events happening in Revelation that can be found in the books of Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and likewise. So we need to realize that John